I've just gained it by owning the property.
Yes.
And basically, I think I should pay tax on that. Or when I die, certainly I should pay tax on it. What have I done to deserve that?
This is the maddest inheritance tax phoning ever. The first bloke's paid it and is pretty comfortable about having to do so, but points out that his really, really, really rich mates don't have to pay it. And the second call doesn't have to pay it, but for perfectly rational and morally just reasons, thinks that he probably should.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what?
3 callers rang James O'Brien with 3 completely different views on inheritance tax. One had already paid it and thought it was fair. One thought he personally should be taxed more. One was still grieving her sister and thought the whole system was wrong. James treated all 3 differently. But with the last call, he said something that's hard to hear and hard to argue with at the same time. Let's watch it together. And before I tell you to like and hit that subscribe button, please allow me the chance to earn that from you.
Inheritance tax affects about 4% of estates. The figure for 2020 to 2021, which I think is the most recently available, stands at about 3.73%. Let's presume it's gone up a little bit since then. You're looking roughly at fewer than 30,000 estates paying inheritance tax. Fewer than 30,000, 27,000 in that given period that are susceptible to inheritance tax. And yet opposition to it stands at about 37%. Today's first hour is going to be dedicated simply to the question of why. So if you've already got an answer to that, you don't need to wait for me to set my stall out. You can jump in immediately and share it on 0345 6060 973, because of all the things that seem to me to sustain inequality, to slow down social mobility, to perpetuate the culture of cap-doffing and deference in this country, the attitude to inheritance tax seems to me to be one of the most powerful. Here are people who have accrued more wealth than they could ever possibly need and more than anybody else in the country has. And when they pass, they will hand on huge sums of cash or significant sums of cash and assets to their heirs, to their descendants, or indeed to the charities and the institutions of their choice. At which point the government will step in and secure a significant chunk of it for the good of the nation, for the good of everybody. For the army, for the NHS, for teachers, for roads, for, well, pretty much everything that hasn't been privatised yet by the Tories. And the more money we can get for that stuff, and listen, of course, there are arguments about efficiency and scleroticism and whatever else you want to call it, but generally speaking, the more money we've got to spend on the country, i.e. everybody's stuff that we all either use or need or will do, then surely the better for everybody concerned, except I suppose the people who can afford to pay their own way for everything from education to healthcare to, well, you can't really pay for your own roads yet in this country, can you? But you take my point. So I'm a naive old soul. I've got a terrible tendency to lurch towards undergraduate idealism on some subjects, and I would stress, lest you accuse me of hypocrisy, that every single time we approach a budget or an autumn statement, for the last 13 years, I find myself being softened up by Tory governments. I find the most fascinating question regarding wealth as how much is enough. And obviously for some people, it's never enough. Enough is never enough. The obvious examples are kind of like Rupert Murdoch, I suppose, but it's never enough. Some people love the work that they do, and it just ends up delivering ever-increasing sums of money to them. I think perhaps Bill Gates would fit into that category, and possibly George Soros. But for other people, it's as if they can never have enough. And I understand that. I think now if the wheels fell off, I could probably get to the finishing line, largely unscathed, but I couldn't yet reach the finishing line enjoying the same standard of living for myself and my loved ones that we currently enjoy. I need a few more years on the hamster wheel before I get to that point. But certainly, childhood dreams of living in an enormous castle with a moat and stuff like that, they don't feel like things like that I've given up on. They just feel like things that were a bit ridiculous at the time. So whenever a budget is approaching or an autumn statement, I find myself wondering why they're constantly trying to look after people who are already doing all right. And then I give my head a wobble and wind my neck in and slap myself around the face with a metaphorical wet fish and say, well, because they want my vote. So they're buying my vote by reflecting my financial security and promising to enhance it still further. Johnny's in on Teeb. Johnny, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Don't savage me, please.
Well, it depends what you say.
I think it is because the middle classes pay it and the rich don't. The rich get away with it. And
this is your personal animus, I suspect, rather than you speaking.
It is indeed.
Yes.
Both my parents have died over the last 4 years.
I'm sorry.
And I paid a chunk of inheritance tax. And I have various rich friends who basically said that's absolute madness that you've had to pay all that money.
No, I can't argue with you. I certainly can't savage you because you describe a grave injustice, albeit that you describe it from a position of relative privilege. You look up the ladder and see people considerably better off than you who, via creative accounting and offshore assets and all the rest of it. They
and trust.
Yeah. They don't own newspapers, do they? These friends of yours, they don't own daily newspapers in this country by any chance, because or indeed.
No, I think they're sort of more hedge funds than just extremely bright accountants.
The royal family. I don't even know how bright you have to be. You just need to be able to afford to pay. And of course, the royal family fall into this category as well. But surely, Johnny, this is an argument for going after those people with a little bit more alacrity.
I totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, I've got friends who own large estates, and they get passed down the line without paying anything, and it is totally unjust. Totally unjust.
Well, they're in trust, so you couldn't. For example, quite a lot of people inheriting the estates you described wouldn't actually be allowed to sell them without either permission of trustees or a bizarre act of God.
Well, I think there's a line where it can be broken.
Yes.
But no, I think you're right. Yeah, they are in trust and they're passed on down, as you say, with the royal family and everyone else. I mean, all these big houses and so on, they just get passed down, and they never pay a bean.
No.
It's the middle classes that get hit. And that's why it's unpopular.
And that's a very big constituency of middle class, because the middle class does not constitute 4% of the population, which is the only constituency eligible for paying inheritance tax. The middle class is probably 30 or 40% of the population. But I take your point. I cannot dispute it at all. In your situation, having been unlucky enough to lose your parents in quick succession, but lucky enough to inherit an estate eligible for inheritance tax, you look at people who've inherited considerably more than you and balk at the way that they've managed to avoid their responsibilities to society.
Yeah, it's kind of. I mean, I don't really balk at it, but it's
a valid complaint.
It's more that the way they say that's crazy what you've had to spend. Because we won't have to, or my children won't have to.
Yes, and that rankles when you bring children into it. That their children won't be susceptible to this charge, and your children will be. That actually rankles, and I think you're in a small cohort, but a cohort with a genuine grievance. I really do. But as we both agree, this is an argument for going after aristocrats and hedge funders rather than complaining about being in the cohort of having to pay. You want to increase the size of the cohort. But that's very true. So you can talk about the 325 threshold or the 650 threshold. Oddly, there's people richer than Croesus who will not be eligible for it at all. Paul is in Bingham. Paul, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Nice to talk to you.
We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a little 3-bedroom house up in Nottinghamshire.
Right.
And we paid $30,000 for it back in the 1980s.
Yes.
It's now valued at something like $275,000.
Right.
Now, I've obviously spent money on making improvements, but there's a huge amount of wealth there that I have now gained through no effort of my own. I've just gained it by owning the property.
Yes.
And basically, I think I should pay tax on that. Or when I die, certainly I should pay tax on it. What have I done to deserve that?
This is the maddest inheritance tax phone-in ever. The first bloke's paid it and is pretty comfortable about having to do so, but points out that his really, really, really rich mates don't have to pay it. And the second call doesn't have to pay it, but for perfectly rational and morally just reasons, thinks that he probably should.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what have I done? I mean, I've lived in the house as well, so
yes.
I reckon the extra wealth there is maybe 175,000. So it's not a vast amount of money.
Well, it's not bad, is it, for doing nothing?
When I die, yes. What have I done to earn that?
Nothing.
I haven't.
You're getting rewarded for being lucky enough for being a homeowner.
Absolutely. So basically, I think as a matter of principle.
Well, I mean, where would you put the threshold then?
Difficult one.
It is, isn't it? Because 325 to me in the southeast seems, that seems reasonable. But of course, you move out of the southeast, and 325 goes a lot further.
Yeah. But somebody who bought a house down in the southeast in the 1980s, they're now worth, I don't know, maybe they've added
Well, they could have added a zero.
Yes, huge amount. What have they done to earn that themselves? They haven't.
No, they haven't. But they have made every calculation.
And lived in the house.
Yes, they've lived in the house, and it has increased in value, often at a greater rate than their salary would have provided.
And the people who are against inheritance tax keep using lines like, "Oh well, I've worked hard to earn all this money, and I've already paid tax on it." Well, that wealth in property you haven't paid tax on.
That's a very good point, actually. That is the argument you always hear. We've already paid tax on it once. The only bit you've paid tax on is the bit that you bought it with. You haven't paid any tax on the bit that it has increased by. June's in Heathrow. June, what would you like to say?
It seems to be that people seem to think that the inheritance tax is for people who've got money. My sister died at the age of 56. Her husband died when her son was 7. Yeah. She worked 3 jobs to keep the roof over her head and to keep everything going for them.
Yes.
Because of where she lives, the house costs more money, but she had to live there because she wanted to be surrounded by a family to help her support her after her husband died.
Yes.
When she died, he had to pay £40,000 in inheritance tax. Now, all she had left was the money to bury her and her house.
And her what?
Now,
the money to bury her and what? Your phone went down.
Sorry, money to bury her and her house. That's the only 2 assets she had when she died.
Right.
Now, she worked three jobs to keep that roof over her son's head.
And there was no mortgage on it?
And no, there was no mortgage on it.
Okay.
Because they paid the mortgage off, but there was...
you put me in a very difficult situation, because she could easily have had a small mortgage on it and only worked 1 job.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I say she's got no mortgage on it. I know she had a loan on it.
Right, well that
is a different thing to a mortgage, isn't it?
Yeah, but it would still come off the estate. So 40,000, so there was about 100 grand of asset over the 300 or over the £500,000. So she left about £600,000.
Yeah.
And
that's what the house is worth.
And your nephew had to pay.
Semi-detached.
No, I know
house.
you told me that. But so it's a £600,000 estate, and your nephew had to pay £40,000 inheritance tax.
Yeah.
So 560 grand clear.
And I know, but it's still.
No, I know, but it's still 560 grand, isn't it?
Life.
Yeah. How much did she pay for the house?
But she's worked all. I don't know how much she paid for it.
When did she buy it?
They come back from she bought it in 1982.
Right, so she probably paid about 1/10 of what its final value was, which is why she had no mortgage.
Yeah, but I still don't think it's right.
Why not?
But someone that's worked all their life.
Yeah, but she got paid for that.
She
got paid for working all her life.
And she paid tax for that as well.
Well, she didn't pay tax on the £500,000 that she made simply by owning a property for 40 years.
No, I'm sorry. I just think it's
You don't have
wrong.
to apologise. Just correct me if I've got anything wrong.
I just think it should be means tested. If you've got these
well, it is means tested.
She lived in another. So
it
she
is
lived
means
in another
tested.
part of the country to keep away from the family who've got no support to look after because she's a widow.
Yeah.
She lived in another part of the country. He wouldn't have had to have paid that.
No. Because the house would have been worth less money. So we'd have inherited less.
Oh.
Yes.
Well, I just think it's wrong.
No, I know you do. You keep saying that, but I just
think it's wrong.
Yes, I know you do. But just to clarify, nothing I've said is wrong. Everything I've described to you is correct. Correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
But if you're working 3 jobs to keep a house going,
yeah. But there's no mortgage on the house, so you didn't. Well, this is why I say you put me in a difficult position, because you're reaching for. Well, that would have come off the estate. So what was left is what gets taxed. And if it was in excess of £500,000, and there's a 40% charge on anything in excess of £500,000 after the loan has been paid. And I think I understand where your sense of injustice comes from, but the number of jobs she did isn't really relevant. She had assets worth £600,000, which puts her in probably the top 10% of the population, however many jobs she worked.
For a 3-bedroom, falling apart house.
Well, it might have been falling apart, but that doesn't change its value, June. You must understand what the house is worth is what the tax is determined by, not how many jobs your sister had or whether or not the window frames needed painting.
It is, not what it's worth.
No, it's how much it's worth. No one says we're going to have a Surrey tax or we're going to have a Blackpool tax. It's how much the house is. If you live in a £2 million house in Blackpool, then you're going to pay £400,000 in inheritance tax.
Can you imagine a house, a £2 million house in Blackpool, what you get?
Yes, I can, yes.
I'm sure it would be less than a 3-bedroom semi that's falling apart, would you?
Yes, it would, but the 3-bedroom semi is worth £600,000 in the area where your sister's house was. I don't know what I can do to help more, really, with this.
Well, I still think it's.
I know you do.
I just don't think it's right.
Yes, I know, but now we can agree that your reasons for thinking that don't really stand up, do they? It's just a feeling.
I still don't think it's
right.
right.
I know, but it's a feeling, isn't it?
It is. It's an emotion.
And there's nothing wrong with that, because your sister's tied up in it and your nephew's tied up in it. But the tax can't take into account your feelings. It can't be an emotional driven tax. It just does. She should have been able to leave everything she had to her son. But then again, who shouldn't be allowed to leave everything they had to their son? Someone in a £1 million house, someone in a £5 million. They've got to draw the line somewhere, and they drew it in a place that meant that your nephew got £560,000 out of a £600,000 estate, which most people listening to would probably think was quite a good result, albeit that it was tragic that he lost his parents so young.
Right. Let's go through all 3 calls, because James lays out something at the start worth holding on to throughout. Inheritance tax only affects around 4% of estates in this country, yet opposition runs closer to 37%. That gap between who's actually affected and who opposes it is basically the whole story here. First, Johnny. He's already paid inheritance tax after losing both parents, and his real complaint isn't the tax existing, it's who gets away with avoiding it. He points out wealthy friends pass on huge estates through trusts without paying anything close to what he paid. James agrees with the substance immediately, but redirects the conclusion. If the wealthy dodge it through clever structuring, the answer isn't abolishing the tax for people like Johnny, it's closing the loopholes. Johnny agrees readily. This sets up the real argument of the whole video. Most anger at inheritance tax isn't anger at the principle, it's anger at unfairness in who dodges it. Then Paul, and this call is genuinely unusual. He owns a modest 3-bedroom house bought decades ago for a fraction of its current value, and instead of complaining, he says plainly he thinks he should be taxed on that increase since he didn't earn it beyond owning the property while the market rose around him. James pushes him on where he'd draw the threshold, and Paul doesn't have a perfect answer, but the instinct is the interesting part. He's identified something most people who benefit from it never examine, A huge chunk of property wealth in this country isn't earned through labour at all. Then June calls, and this is where the video gets genuinely difficult in a good way. Her sister died at 56, having worked 3 jobs alone to support her son after being widowed young, leaving an estate worth around £600,000, resulting in a £40,000 tax bill for June's nephew. Her argument is emotional and completely understandable. Her sister worked incredibly hard, and it feels deeply unfair that any of that gets taxed. James's handling of this call is the most important stretch in the whole video. He never questions how hard June's sister worked or dismisses the grief underneath the call, but he doesn't let the emotional weight change the actual maths. The house's value isn't determined by how many jobs someone worked to keep it, it's what it's actually worth on the market, and nobody's proposing a tax based on hardship because that would be completely unworkable in the opposite direction. The estate placed her in roughly the top 10% by value, and after the £40,000 bill, June's nephew still walked away with £560,000 out of £600,000, which by any reasonable measure is not a bad outcome, even though losing his mother that young obviously was tragic. The moment that really lands is when James gently gets June to say it herself. It's not really an argument, it's a feeling. He doesn't treat that as a gotcha. He agrees there's nothing wrong with having that feeling, given everything wrapped up in it. But a tax system can't be built around individual emotional narratives, because for every June, there's someone else with an equally sympathetic story attached to a much larger estate. And the line has to be drawn somewhere that doesn't depend on whose story sounds most compelling that day. What ties all 3 calls together is this. Almost nobody actually affected by inheritance tax objects because they've worked through the economics. They object because it feels unfair the moment it touches their own life. James doesn't dismiss any of those feelings. He just keeps asking everyone to separate the feeling from the argument, and almost every time, the argument for exemption gets a lot weaker than the feeling behind it. That's where I am on it. Genuinely, thank you for sitting with something heavier today. If it made you think differently, even slightly, do the thing, like it, share it, subscribe. It actually helps more than you'd think.